Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event, which today is focused on the challenges facing the UK labour market and the action government can take to address them. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm director here at the Work Foundation. We're a research and policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University. And we're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market, the interrelationship between work and health, and the challenges specifically facing young people in the labour market today. Now, we're meeting today at a time not only of international instability, but domestic political instability too. And the labour market, in many ways, lies at the heart of these national political debates. And as we get closer to the Makerfield by-election, I think we can expect to see these discussions intensify with a focus on the impacts of deindustrialisation, access to secure employment, routes to progression for young people, and the extent to which the way that Westminster and Westminster politicians think about the economy and the jobs market is fit for purpose. And in many respects, this isn't surprising. Work Foundation analysis over a number of years has shown that severe insecurity has been a feature of the UK labour market for millions of workers over the course of the last 20 to 25 years, characterised by high levels of low pay, unpredictable hours for many workers, and a lack of access to key employment rights. Falling living standards, flatlining real pay growth, and stubbornly low economic growth has also impacted people's experience of work across the country since the financial crisis. And it's left many workers particularly vulnerable to the shock of the COVID pandemic and the inflationary pressures that have followed. And of course, all of these issues have been experienced more acutely in those parts of the country with weaker local economies and where there are fewer opportunities for growth. So I think when politicians from across the political spectrum describe an ambition to break with the politics and the economy of recent decades in different ways, they're in part talking about finding ways to address these longer-term challenges in the UK labour market. Now, of course, the government has brought substantial focus to these areas already, prioritising a new Employment Rights Act to strengthen access to employment protections, guaranteed hours and flexible working, as well as major reviews into supporting more people impacted by ill health to access and remain in employment, and to support more young people into employment as well. And we'll be reflecting on those throughout the course of the session today, but we'll also be doing so through the lens of the latest data from the ONS that was released this week, together with some of these longer term trends that have been shaping the jobs market for a number of years. To help us do that, we'll be hearing from a fantastic panel of contributors, including Simon French, the Managing Director and Chief Economist and Head of Research at Panmure Liberum, Andrea Barry, Deputy Director at the Centre for Ageing Better, and Emma Taggart, Economics Reporter at the Telegraph. Before we hear from our panelists, I do just want to briefly provide an overview of the key statistics released by the ONS this week. And unfortunately, there isn't a great deal of positive news, as you'll see from these few slides. Unemployment is up to 5%. That's rising again after a sort of surprise drop last month. The rate of youth unemployment is at an 11-year high, and perhaps most concerningly when it comes to young people, 1 in 5 young unemployed people have been out of work for more than a year. And that's got really significant potential implications for when it comes to sort of longer term scarring. So the impact that that can have on their wages and future career prospects. Outside of the pandemic, we've also seen over a number of months now, vacancies continuing to fall. And outside of the pandemic, they've now reached their lowest level for 11 years. And that's creating an increasingly competitive jobs market with 2.5 job seekers per vacancy. And while employment rates are broadly similar to a year ago, there's interesting things going on in terms of the kind of demographics of those who are employed. Nearly 200,000 more people aged 65 and above in work compared to a year ago. On wages, average increases are around 3.4% on the year, but real wage growth is sitting at just 0.1%. If we can move on to the next slide, we can dig a little bit deeper on those figures on pay growth. And you can see here how levels of pay growth have been falling over the last 12 months. And that particularly sharp increase in the public sector line, that can be accounted for by public sector pay awards towards the end of last year. But overall, you can see the line has then flattened out and actually is falling again. And finally, we've had some new inflation data released today, where we've seen a fall in the rate to 2.8% in April, which does represent some good news. But most forecasters expect that to rise again as we get back through, as we start to get through 2026. The impact of the war in the Middle East has not really fully hit those figures yet. And the IMF has warned that the UK is forecast to experience the highest inflation of any G7 economy over the next 2 years. And that's going to mean that the sort of issues around the cost of living and the government's response to that is going to remain really, really important. And 90% of the public, according to the ONS, have rated it as the most important issue facing the UK today. So, with this rather challenging context in mind, I'm now going to hand over to our speakers who are going to provide a few minutes of their initial reflections before we open up the conversation more broadly. So, Simon, I'll hand over to you first.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Work Foundation for the invitation to speak. So I think just 2 or 3 opening comments on the data we've released and what it tells us about the UK economy right now. I think my major takeaway from the jobs data yesterday was the softness of demand at the moment. I think the headline that a lot of the news organizations picked up on, which was a drop of 100,000 in the payroll employment in April, should be taken with not just a pinch of salt, but probably a fair bucket load of salt. It's the start of the tax year. It's traditionally the month when the payroll data is most erratic, and on average, payrolls have been updated over the last 3 years by an average of 50,000 per month. So you could conceivably excuse away half of that softness just as a result of some of that sort of seasonal start of tax year volatility. It doesn't, however, take away from the trend of payroll growth having peaked very shortly after the last general election in mid-2024. And while the LFS, the Workforce and Jobs Survey, and the payroll data are showing slightly different pictures, collectively they're showing pretty soft labour demand, which comes to my second point. And I thought Ben's introduction covered a lot of the policy backdrop that is influencing the labour market at the moment. And one of the worries I would have, I certainly have had for some time, is that having begun my career, and unfortunately it's now 24 years ago at DWP, working on labour market analysis, some of the more successful labour market interventions are when government tries interventions on regulating in areas of low pay in terms of rights, gets feedback in terms of how they may happen in sort of local pilots at a micro scale, and then rolls them out nationally if they work. One of my concerns with the current level of labour demand is this government trying too much at one go? The national living wage, the employer national insurance increases, and the employee rights bill as a cocktail at a time when employers structurally are asking how much labour they need in the mix because of some of the disruptive influences of AI. That's a lot for employers to absorb right now. So I think there is a debate, maybe we'll come on to in the Q&A, as to whether too much has been attempted and the labour force putting too much weight on employers in one go, all with very virtuous intentions, but collectively quite damaging for demand. And to finish on a bright spot, Ben mentioned some of the politics that seem to now be set to amplify over the next 6 weeks, maybe over most of the summer. A very politically contentious part of the UK labour market has been the impact of migration into the UK labour market over a couple of decades, but perhaps most saliently since the end of Brexit. Actually, one of the data points I was most interested in yesterday was the fact that for the first time in history, those people born outside the UK and Europe now have a higher employment rate than the native born population. And that spread, that underemployment level was about 20 percentage points as recently as 2008. So you've seen a real closing up of the labour market participation, labour market engagement of people who were born outside the UK, migrants. Now, whether that has any political resonance remains to be seen, but certainly from an economic standpoint, that's a really positive development on labour market attachment of migrant cohorts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. Really, really helpful context to put those figures in, and we'll definitely pick up on some of those issues as we get into the fuller conversation. Andrea, I'm going to hand over to you now, though, for your initial reflections.
Great, and thank you for having me. Just to introduce myself, I am from the Center for Aging Better. I think our interest really in what's been going on in the labor market and the overall economy over the last few years is largely that, it's not it's not a great picture, right? I think we can all admit that the economy in the UK has not been outperforming expectations for a very long time. I think we could even go way back to the Great Recession, which was mentioned earlier. I think one of the issues I would have within some of the stats, one that was laid out is the fact that the older population is seen through this lens of this under the 65s and the over 65s. There's been a lot of other policy developments related to the over 50s, especially around pensions and state pension age. That actually means we should be having that conversation of the under 67-year-olds and then the people who are over the age of 67. We're happy to see more people over the age of 65 and 67 in work, especially if that's something they want to do. I think with the inflation figures we've seen here, we do recognize that there are some people who are heading back into work past state pension age or past retirement, quote unquote retirement, who are working because they have to, not because they want to. And that becomes an issue because it's, excuse me, when we saw yesterday from the Pension Commission's interim report that more and more people are leading up into retirement age without an adequate pension, they're not saving enough, they don't have enough money that they're earning through work to be able to save and sustain themselves well into retirement and to live longer as we are living longer on average. That becomes an issue. Can this economy and can our labor market absorb the amount of people who are returning to work because they need to work at any age versus people who are able to stay in and out of the labor market as it pertains to them for other reasons, for well-being reasons, for those types of reasons? That becomes an issue. Excuse me, for me. So I think when I'm thinking of our 50 plus population, we have a lot of people who are out of work due to health conditions, who want to go back into work, but at the moment are unable to work. And if the economy and the labor market continues in the way it is now, it will be very difficult for them to get back into work. We have just run a piece of work in Greater Manchester that saw people trying to return to work after 5, 6, up to 8 years out of work. And there was very little for them to do that. And our economy and our labor market should be able to absorb people to come back in with their skills when they want or when they need to. So if I have a one line thing I'm really, really concerned about with this labor market and what's going on in the UK economy as a whole, it is unable to deal with people at both sides, both ends of the labor market, the under 25-year-olds and the over 50-year-olds, who are making choices for them in education, out of education, in work, out of work, partially retired, doing caring responsibilities, health conditions. It is unable to absorb both ends of the labor market in a healthy way. There aren't enough jobs, 700,000 vacancies, and that's the ONS's figure. 700,000 vacancies for an economy this large is simply not enough jobs to absorb the amount of people who should be, are, or want to be looking for a job. And quite frankly, it can't continue. So I think that's all I will say for now, because I have loads more I could say about what I think should be going on. But I think when I look at these figures, I think it's a continuation of some of the problems we've seen earlier for the last few years, and I don't see how it's getting better.
Thanks, Andrea, and we certainly will get into some of the things that need to be done about those challenges. But Emma, I'll come to you to round off our initial contributions, and then we'll open the conversation out.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you for having me. I wanted to touch on the youth unemployment figures that we've seen. It's been rising for a while, and now the most recent statistics show that it's at an 11-year high. I think this is particularly concerning. As Andrea mentioned, it seems like both age groups at each end of the spectrum are in particular being impacted. I think it's unfortunately unsurprising that in a downturn, young people often bear the brunt of a cooling labour market. I think part of the reason that this seems to be occurring is that there's just been a widespread decline, unfortunately, in jobs across the retail and hospitality sector. Many of these businesses have had to cut jobs if they've struggled with rising costs, whether that's in terms of labour or input costs. I think also concerningly, we know that whenever a young person has a period of unemployment at the beginning of their career, that this can have long-term scarring impacts, even 10 years down the line, and that young people who graduate although we're not in a recession right now, young people who graduate into a challenging or recessionary job market can have long-term scarring impacts. We know that there's been a lot of government work and reviews ongoing. Last year, we had a review from Sir Charlie Mayfield, who found that for a 22-year-old who dropped out of work due to ill health, the cost to them could be as much as £1 million over the course of their lifetime, in comparison to if they had remained in work. And indeed, from his review, it seems that rising mental health reports among young people may be a particular challenge in why we're seeing a rise in economic inactivity and youth unemployment. Recent NEET figures, so the number of young people who are not in education, employment, or training, are near 1 million, which I think is really troubling for an economy. We should be looking to boost the career fortunes and opportunities of young people moving forward. Thanks very much. I think I'm sure there's lots more we can touch on when it comes to youth unemployment, but that's all for now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. And if I can ask everyone to turn their cameras on now, we'll open up the conversation. And just say to everyone on the call, I'm really keen to get some questions and contributions from you as well. So if you can use the Q&A tab, please, I'll keep an eye across that and I will try and put as many of your questions and points to our panel as we go through. But as we wait for those to come in, Simon, I wonder if I could just come to you first and maybe just ask you to sort of expand a little bit, I suppose, on your reflections that you had around why we're seeing the sort of bigger picture that we are today and how you would sort of characterize the mix of some of the longer term trends that are maybe shaping that versus some of the sort of shorter term decisions or issues that the government's having to respond to.
Yes, because I think those are the right lenses to look at this. We have, on a longer term view, been very good actually as a country of generating the jobs that were required, which I think Andrea's comments were very salient actually, is for the first time in quite a long time outside the sort of recessionary period of 2008 and then after the sort of pandemic, we're actually questioning whether there is enough demand out there, and have policymakers perhaps taken for granted the fact that we have an economy that will generate a lot of jobs and can burden on some of the frictions. And those are not just, as Emma mentioned, the frictions directly on the labour market, but it's the total cost frictions that make you question which other factors of production you might need. So if you're paying more for your electricity, paying more for your investment because of higher interest rates, do you look to shed what may previously been a relatively rich labour mix in your overall factors of production? So I think there's a big macroeconomic question there on the total cost burden and whether actually we have incrementally boiled the jobs frog here. Then there's the sort of the shorter term policy question, which I alluded to in my opening comments, which are employer national insurance looks to me like a really bad choice of tax increase at a time when you were looking to push through another considerably above inflationary increase in the national living wage, and you were bringing through what eventually was quite a watered down employee rights bill, but was still, I think the final impact assessment was about a £1 billion burden on UK employers. As I say, given all, and one of the things I did mention at the back end was the very positive news on migration, but there's clearly also a challenge because successive Home Secretaries, James Cleverly, then Yvette Cooper, have tightened the visa route for skilled workers into the UK. So again, some of the levers that employers could pull in order to get access to the skills, we talk about the totality, but the skills have also been closed off. So you've got this, confluation of policy factors at a time when that structural question mark over whether employers are creating the kind of rich demand picture for workers we've seen over a number of decades.
That's really helpful, Simon. Andrew, I'm going to come to you next to get your reflections on this question. But just before I do, I just want to ask Simon briefly, some of the things that we're seeing in particularly in the kind of stock of jobs available, for example, the kind of number of graduate roles that are available, as I understand it, those things have been declining for a little while now. Is that right? So not necessarily a direct outcome of some of the more recent choices from government, but actually we over a number of years we've seen sort of fall off there. Do you have a sense of why that is, and sort of what might be able to be done about it, or is there anything to be done about it?
Well, so I think there are two reflections I would have. Is one, I agree with you on the data. This is a little bit more longer dated in the graduates market, and here technological change. Yes, we're used to generative AI being a relatively new story, but actually some of the technological disruptions that predated ChatGPT that have been making, if you like, the demand for starter jobs straight out of university, that has diminished. I think that is playing a role here, but also the element of whether we're generating something of a mismatch between the skills that employers are demanding for and the skills that our university is churning out, and where those skills are being churned out, country of where graduates choose to go and find their first job is quite an interesting change that I've seen emerge because of the tax burden, the total tax burden faced by graduates now, if you take into account not just the freezing of some of the tax thresholds, but also the repayment of student loans. And as those cohorts come through, that's affecting more of the jobs market. Reflection in my sector, financial services, a lot of the banks in our space are not losing their most talented people to competitor UK domicile banks. They're losing them to other countries, particularly in the Middle East, where some of those opportunities, certainly after tax, are a bit more lucrative.
Interesting. Thanks for that, Simon. Andrea, your reflections on that sort of question more broadly, and actually, as well, given your some of the remarks you made at the beginning, any sort of reflections you've got on what government has done right so far in terms of trying to support perhaps particularly those older workers to kind of re-enter the labour market? I'm thinking things around flexibility of employment, or around enhanced employment support, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I would actually say just a couple things. Some people may know this. In my previous role, I was principal economist at Youth Futures Foundation, so heavy youth focus for 4 years of my life. And one thing I would add about the earlier end of the labor market for young people, and this actually pertains as well to the over 50s, there's been a shift overall with employment. There's been a shift overall with employers and your relationship with employers for probably the last 20 years, 25 years. There is no longer your expectation that you stay with an employer and train and learn and develop with them in the same way that you used to see in the past. So employers are not taking on that role of developing their talent in the same way. A great example I always use is my husband. Quite frankly, he did graduate scheme at Network Rail. He has been with them for over 20 years. He has been in the same employer for over 20 years, developed consistently. And that was early 2000s that he joined them. That opportunity for young people does not exist anymore. It's just not simply there in the same way that it used to be. And I think expectations some young people, excuse me, rightly or wrongly have when they go to an employer and expect to be nurtured as a talent in a way that maybe they used to see in past cohorts were nurtured, given training development opportunities, trained in certain things to do the role, and maybe arriving with fewer skills than expected and still given the tools they need to do that is not the same anymore. They are expected to show up differently than they have in the past. And I'm not sure this mismatch in that, which I think Simon is talking about, is happening anymore. You're not getting what you need necessarily to go straight into some of these roles. And employers are not taking on a role of helping develop that talent. Some of it may be due to costs. You know, there is the training budget, there's the apprenticeships budget that they have. They have money there to train people and train young people and older people to do the role that they need that is not being taken up. And I think it's also, they may not see that they have the time to do that anymore because they're dealing with so many other factors, like not a great economy overall. You know, I don't like to mention Brexit, but leaving the European Union has had an impact on demand in the UK. You know, changing relationship with the United States due to, you know, the special relationship maybe changing, trade wars with the, you know, tariffs, all of these things, the wider context is having a an impact on demand in the UK. So if you're an employer, you're not thinking, I have the time to work directly with someone who needs this additional help to do the job, rightly or wrongly. That I'm not putting blame on anyone in this situation, but to me, this is what it looks like to me overall.
Yeah.
So we get these issues where we're expecting one thing and this cannot. One thing I will say, especially when you're looking at these populations that might need additional support in work, something we say at Aging Better all the time is it's not expensive. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be difficult. There are tools available to do that. The government, through Mayfield, one thing I will say through Mayfield, clearly thinking about these lots of people out with poor health conditions that really could re-enter the labor market. One thing I would say is re-enter the labor market to what is one thing I would add. You know,
Yeah.
given where a lot of these people are who are not as healthy as they need to be in the labor market. We saw through healthy life expectancy, some areas of the country with really bad healthy life expectancy also do not have a great labor market at the same time. So if
Yeah.
you're trying to nurture these people to re-enter into a labor market, again, re-enter into what? Mayfield did address more than one age group, which for looking at the over 50s has not been done in the last couple of years. I mean, the shift in government has seen a shift in their attention to certain ages, and they're not really interested in the over 50 population unless it's to do with pensions and then health. So Mayfield really said we are trying to get people who are older into work, and we're trying to get people to be healthy enough to go into work, and we're trying to get people who are under the age of 25 healthy, especially on the mental health aspect, to go into work.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a bright spot in working with Vanguards. What they actually do and the money attached to what they actually do, especially through employment support money, is another thing. There's very little, if anything, there that they've given out from that. But I think that's a great start, and it's a great almost leadership start. We hear from employers through our pledge. We want more leadership from government on what we could be doing more and could be doing better. And I think that needs to also come from them
Yeah.
through the Mayfield review.
Well, we'll definitely come back in to sort of explore some of those challenges and questions you just outlined there around what's going to come forward with in terms of funding and support for that. But and I also want to come back to both yourself and Simon around potentially some of the trade-offs involved here, given the pressures that are on employers and on employees themselves, and how government might work that too. But Emma, just to come to you, I'm sort of struck as well. You know, we've explored already quite a complex and interrelated set of factors here, but government arrived into office sort of promising mission-led government with an industrial strategy and a sort of sense that growth was going to be the most important ambition for them. And yet it strikes me that they've sort of struggled to maintain a coherent narrative around some of this and sort of way of telling the story of how they plan to support more growth in the future. Would you agree with that? And do you think they have the ingredients within the sort of policy agenda to try and reclaim some of that over the rest of the Parliament?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, Ben. I think some of the comments that Simon made earlier around Nick's national insurance and the increase in cost that was put on to employers has definitely filtered through. And as a result, we started to see some backsliding in terms of the job opportunities available, but it isn't spread out equally across the UK. We know that in parts of the country that are unfortunately deindustrialized. There are weaker parts of towns and cities that have weaker labor markets. And so if you're a person who's already maybe struggling with long-term unemployment, seeing the picture now for the economy doesn't exactly give you much confidence. And it's hard to see unless we can do something to get economic growth going and offer new opportunities. But whenever we have so much uncertainty, not just domestically, but globally, it provides a really challenging picture for businesses to want to increase hiring. It's not going to be an area that they want to prioritize first. I think we've seen figures now for a while, and even in the past couple of months, areas such as the UK's manufacturing sector, the construction sector, that has been struggling for several months, but it seems like it's unlikely to pick up anytime soon, which is incredibly frustrating for those people living in areas that already have weak labour markets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Em. That's really helpful. And I guess particularly considering some of those sectors are connected to areas where government did promise to drive growth in terms of construction, building houses, infrastructure investment, etc. So, Simon, just to kind of come back to some of the things you were reflecting on and picking up on Emma and Andrea's points as well. So we sort of if one accepts that we've got this challenge where we want to support more people, particularly relating to sort of those with health challenges, to sort of remain in the workplace, to enter in the workplace, and that would be a good thing both for them as individuals, but also for the labour market as a whole. What's your sort of sense of how we move away from this idea that making some of the changes that could help with that being seen purely as a cost and therefore something which employers might be sort of inherently skeptical about or actually kind of pushing back? I'm thinking about some of the changes around flexible working, for example, potentially some of the changes around occupational health or sort of wider skills and training programs, things like that. How do you see these as necessarily in opposition to one another, and how can we move past that?
My own personal view is that we have got ourselves rather locked into a policy cycle of downstream sticking plasters to upstream problems. So why are employers perhaps pushing back at some of what are very worthwhile initiatives on skills and supporting people with complex requirements in the workplace? It's because we are in a sustained profits recession in the UK, and as a result of the highest energy costs in the world, the result of having not built houses at anything like the G7 rate for 4 decades, and as a result of having starved our economy of capital through our pension system and our retail savings ecosystem, we're effectively rationed or made the costs of energy, of land, by extension, housing, and of raising finance prohibitively high. And if you are faced by all those cost burdens as an employer, and you can't substitute out of things like energy, you can't substitute out of your business rates, your land, your cost of capital is determined by the markets and determined by where pension funds allocate their capital, then there are only so many levers you can pull in order to remain a profitable going concern, to continue as an entity. So one of my frustrations with this government coming in and saying its primary mission is growth is it then becomes very micro very quickly, rather than diagnosing what I think are the big macro issues, which if you resolve those macro issues, a lot of those, to go back to your original question, those things that employers are seeing as a cost, they're not doing it because they are not sympathetic to the needs of workers, or because it's very much in their bottom line interest to do these things, but they're just being squeezed at other things that are beyond their controls. They're having to control the things they can control in terms of line items. Change the economic growth outlook, change the factors of production, you get a lot of these solutions solving themselves.
That's really helpful, Simon. Andrea, any reflections on that? But also, we've had a question from Amy, sort of building on your point around your husband's role and experience of that sort of longer term progression route through an organization. And it's an interesting one. Is the extent to which whether now that experience has become perhaps more rare, do we risk sort of then almost baking that in as sort of managers and leaders who themselves haven't had that experience, then don't drive that through their own organizations? Are we at risk of essentially losing that completely from the sort of management life cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when I was speaking about it with him, when I realized just how long he had been in the same employer, I realized you get a lot of operational loss when people move and continue to move around. There's a lot of information, especially, again, thinking of your over 50s, a lot of information, a lot of institutional information that people have that when they leave. And I also think when you're a line manager and you're fully expecting this person to leave, but also recognizing this is not a great labor market. If they leave, you can find someone to fill the shoes relatively easily, and you can probably try and spend the time to train them. You're not always going to give that person the most you can to make them stay. And I'm trying to be careful here because I don't want to blame a group of people who are only responding to what they have in front of them, right? You have employers and line managers, and then also individuals responding to the conditions that exist around them. And I think that was Simon's point. They're only responding to the fact there's not much else they can do to survive an economy that is simply not growing in the way that it should. And some of the issues around not the lack of growth is coming from the top. It's coming from the overall sustainability of the UK economy as a thing, right? So if you're an employer in the UK, you would love to be able to spend as much time as possible nurturing your talent to keep them because it's a significant loss to continue to recruit over and over for individuals to fill that role. But at the same time, you recognize that is a cost you cannot take on at the moment because you're struggling to even stay afloat. There's a Business Insights survey that comes out every 2 weeks from the ONS, and it does show that significant numbers of employers in different sectors consistently say that they are largely just trying to stay the course until things overall get better. So they're trying to just stay afloat until there's a period where they can see that they could grow further. So
Yeah.
again, I don't want to blame line managers. They do have a role in this, but that is a cultural change that would have to come across the entire country that sees investment in people as a thing that should continue. But when we have the ability to invest, because we have the financial ability to invest.
Yes, yeah. No, that's really helpful. I want to just move us on slightly to have a bit of a chat around sort of place-based responses to some of the challenges that we're seeing. Partly picking up, Emma, on some of the things you were reflecting on before about the kind of different labour markets that we have across the country. But obviously, Andy Burnham has sort of risen in prominence in the in the national political debate over the course of recent months, talking about Manchesterism and the idea that actually a lot of the answers to some of the UK's big challenges would be found in greater levels of devolution. Government themselves have obviously been piloting and already in the sort of process of devolving skills, employment policies. We've had the youth trailblazers over recent years as well. But Emma, I just wondered whether, given Burnham's interventions and perhaps his trajectory politically, whether we think this is going to become a sort of a more salient point going forward and a bigger feature of policy making and responding to some of these challenges.
Yeah, it seems like right across the economy and governance, we're seeing more of a focus on devolution and the devolution of powers in many areas, but especially in terms of labour markets, like you mentioned with youth trailblazers and the piloting of those. I think it's really interesting because specific areas of the country have very different labour markets and the quality of jobs available. I think it's what works for specifically school leavers in a London borough looks very different to something that works for school leavers in Bradford or Birmingham or and in a place maybe where there's the type that are available are in work warehouses or the work just looks very different right across the country. I think those kind of the emphasis on finding work but also making sure that that work is good quality work and can send young people. I'm specifically focusing on young people here, but of course it matters right across the age cohort and the labor market, and ultimately ensuring that the jobs are of good quality and also of provide value in terms of the UK's productivity, which we know has been struggling for a while, and but ensuring that people are in work and in roles that provide value add and boost productivity is one way
Yeah.
forward. I think there's also a challenge in terms of the public sector there, but that's a whole other. You could I've moved away slightly from the devolved aspect of it
No, that's really helpful, and
and
certainly
going into
tallies.
productivity.
Oh, sorry, you broke up just there. But yeah, no, really, really helpful. And it certainly tallies with the Work Foundation's analysis around, the extent to which a lot of this debate is centered in the sort of supply side of greater employment support, but actually for lots of local places, the sort of stock of good quality, secure employment is a really big challenge, particularly when it comes to entry level roles. And Simon, I wondered whether from your side you might give us a sense of what makes for a successful local labour market. And obviously not everywhere can be Greater Manchester. Not everywhere has the scale of a sort of major conurbation like that. And for many young people, or as Emma was saying, other cohorts, actually the kind of stock of viable employment opportunities in their place may well be constrained and providing a barrier in itself.
So, as someone who I've now written a column in the Times for almost a decade, and one of my earliest columns was advocating moving the Parliament out of London. And you've never seen an email response bag like that. People who thought it was a terrible idea. But, I'm from Hull originally. I'd love Parliament to move to Hull rather than SW1, but I doubt it's going to happen. But look, I guess the intellectual genus of the idea was that I think if you look at the big economic value regions of the world, it is where clusters of expertise can emerge. And we've had a rich history of that in the UK, of regional towns focusing on a single industry or single specialism being globally relevant. And I think I used the line in the column that it's an economic model we've forgotten about. It's not that it isn't valid in the current 21st century economy. It absolutely is, but we haven't primed that. And I think to pick up on Emma's point about the public sector, I think the public sector has a really important role of priming it, not with sort of funding pots and setting up a sort of bidding war, but actually by positioning policy expertise at the most senior level in particular areas. So my big frustration is that a lot of the early devolution of civil service roles out to the regions were a kind of relatively low seniority level, and actually none of the, dare I say it, the sort of decision makers were outside Whitehall. And therefore, you never really got true devolution of policymaking responsibility. But also overlay that both the seniority lens, but also the specialism lens. I mean, if you think of the economic advantage of the Northeast in terms of its access to the North Sea, both for renewables and traditional hydrocarbons, there should be a university and a public sector, and you can think of the great universities down to steal a line from Blackadder, Hull would be one of those great universities, but there's also Durham and Newcastle. But you can think in Leeds, and you can think of those areas that could become intellectual hubs for the best IP in terms of training people to work in the renewables energy sector. But why would you not have DESNES based in one of those cities with the ministerial team, the permanent secretary team based there? I think in terms of proper sort of regional devolution at scale, it can't be piecemeal. It has to be really focused, in my view, on picking a sector where we know there is going to be a footprint because it's the public sector, it's permanent. You put the policy expertise then, and then the private sector and the university sector will then crowd in around that. And, if you want an example, yes, it comes back to Manchester, but, if you think of the creative industries,
Yes.
your quasi-public sector of the BBC moving to Manchester, to Salford, look at the hub economics that have emerged in the creative sector around that. Well, there's your concept proved in the 21st century. We'll do it across a range of industries across the range of the UK.
Yeah, really interesting. It's certainly something from my experience where government, over the course of the last 10 years, really, it seems to me, when broadly looking at devolution, has taken a sort of responsive stance. So this kind of deal making and the emphasis has been put onto places to come and then almost have their homework marked and then a kind of deal kind of be, as opposed to taking a much more proactive role as the state, as you say. Andrea, you mentioned one of your responses earlier around in particular, I think around older workers who perhaps are facing pressure to come back into the labour force, having been out of work for some time, and we know the longer one's out of work, the harder it can be to return to the labour market more broadly. Is that something where a more devolved approach could help and sort of improving the kinds of support on offer to that demographic through trusted institutions, community spaces, etc., could actually yield better results?
Yeah, think so. And quite frankly, Greater Manchester is an example of this. We've been working with the Combined Authority for years now. We just, again, I said before, we just published a summary report on doing that type of work yesterday, actually, that did show that you do have a better, you can have a better outcome if the decisions and the questions and the understanding around skills and local labor market work is being done locally. I mean, I think one thing I would have to say again is on the money attached to it, right? So if we're expecting, if we want a greater Manchester like example across, again, I live in the north. If we want that across loads of different areas, coastal areas, we need a substantial investment of money in those areas. The greater Manchester has a bonus in that it has I wouldn't say a great economy, but it has the ability to have a great, well-functioning economy because of where it sits within the country. Not every area has that, so we would not expect every area to have that same relationship when it comes to employment support on a local level into good jobs. We do see some areas trying to do that. I think one of the greatest examples of that is some of the work that U Futures is doing with local employers, working directly with locals, and well, I say local stock, but local individuals, local young people to make sure that the skills actually match what the employers need themselves, but you are still sometimes missing that overarching view of what the skills should be in the area rather than what they are currently looking for at the moment and what you are aspiring to be as a local economy versus what you are currently as a local economy. So I think if that strategic overarching look of what you could be, considering what you could be, if that makes sense, expectations of what you could be and trying to match that towards what you want to be as an outcome is able to be seen at a local level with employment support, then that's great. But I'm not sure of whether that would actually happen at a local level, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that can be seen unless, I mean, I guess for me is the piecemeal bits across the country is not helping this conversation where some are getting this, some are getting that, some have this, some have that. If anything, it would need to have been a full rollout all at once where everyone gets this at the same time. This is what everyone's package looks like at the same time. And areas with higher need get more money to deal with that need versus those maybe with lower need don't get as much money to deal with it.
Yes, yeah, no, I mean the UK's patchwork of local authority administration. I don't think anybody would design it that way if they had to. But I think the sort of prospect of reorganising that all in one go has put off successive ministers, civil servants, etc. Simon, I'm conscious you need to leave us slightly early, so I'm going to come to you just now for sort of final thoughts, really, and then I'll come to Emma and Andrea afterwards around what really you think government needs to be prioritising through the rest of 2026, but also the remainder of the Parliament to try and boost pay, drive up employment, and sort of support greater employer confidence, as you've been describing, in the months ahead.
One word, inflation. Inflation is the element of the UK's economic picture that looks like a significant outlier. It's the reason why the cost of government borrowing, despite relatively low debt levels by G7 standards, by a relatively austere deficit profile set out by both the Treasury and validated by the OBR, those yields are reflecting we've become an inflationary economy again, having lanced that particular macroeconomic boil through some pretty hard decisions in the 80s and early 90s. And if you like, one of the frustrations I have with there's some stuff that Andy Burnham and Manchester Economics talks about, which I am appealed to. But this idea that the UK has had 40 years of neoliberalism does not stack up in the data, unfortunately. And one of the things that the supply side agenda that he so rails against did was bring the UK back into the pack of no longer being an inflationary outlier. We have now become an inflationary outlier again. So for the rest of the Parliament, not just the Bank of England, but the Treasury, all policymakers need to find a way of the UK no longer being seen as what it has been merged as an inflation outlier, because real incomes then go further. the cost of capital comes down, a lot of the downstream problems that we've talked about in this call will be solved by inflation being brought back under control.
Brilliant, really helpful, Simon. Thank you so much for your contributions, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And actually, Simon, sort of reflections there lead me on to the final issue I did want to just pick up before we wrap up the conversation, which was around the kind of cost of living. And so, yes, we've seen the inflation data today, but we've also seen government take some choices around postponing the planned rise in fuel duty, and apparently there's more announcements to come. And I just wonder, Emma, whether you sort of had any reflections around that sort of broader piece around the kind of political salience of the cost of living, the extent to which government is going to be able to get on top of really supporting those who need it most to sort of ride out this period of rising prices.
Yeah, I think for the proportion of households who are in the bottom half of the income distribution, I think this is the number one issue. And I think it's only going to become more important over the summer, especially if energy prices remain high going into winter. It's extremely troubling for a lot of households. And this comes at a time of we're seeing um, or it's expected that in the coming months we'll see food price inflation alongside rising unemployment. It paints a really troubling picture. The cost. I think whenever we see a leadership challenge, especially at this time, and Andy Burnham's focus on tackling the cost of living and also the announcements that we've seen today from Keir Starmer, it's clearly a really salient point. I think it's probably the most salient point within the political sphere since the start of the year. When he remembers the beginning of the new year reset, whenever the cost of living was on the agenda, then I think it's become a defining issue, not just in the UK but in New York in the mayoral election, and I think it underscores the underlying point facing many households, which if they're facing a challenge economic situation and precarious jobs, then these things can culminate into going into the supermarket, looking at your grocery shop going up, and thinking, how am I going to make it to the end of the month? Unfortunately, so anything that the government can do to kind of like tackle those issues. I think it's just how much that resonates with the public whenever prices are still rising.
Yes, yeah, well, this is it, and it's not as if oh, sorry, I mean, you broke up just slightly there, but no, indeed, I think it's prices unlikely to come back down, and so it's that sort of being able to communicate that at least government intervention is sort of reducing the speed of some of those rises. And I wonder, Andrew, from your point of view, I mean, Emma's touched on there on some of the kind of parts of the population that are perhaps most vulnerable, whether there's particular interventions you'd like to see from government, particularly with kind of older people in mind, but potentially with younger people as well, given your previous roles, to make sure that they're not overly adversely impacted or can be mitigated as much as possible.
I was going to make an initial point that, when inflation drops, it still means prices are rising, and price rises are normal. It's normal with a well-functioning economy, so we should expect prices to rise. We should expect wages to rise above what the prices are, and that's not happening. So I think if you're a young person and you see that jobs are not even giving you a chance, because you don't have quote unquote enough experience, or you're over the age of 50 and you're trying to stay in work or go back into work because you have to work, and employers are not giving you a chance because because of your age or because they think that your skills are not needed. I think it can be really difficult to look at that and think to yourself, what can be better other than, this sounds really simplistic to say, better jobs, better economic conditions that can create better jobs. I know there is a lot of conversation around the triple lock and what that means for younger people. I think the triple lock has been helpful in reducing poverty rates and pensioners. Quite frankly, we have the evidence for that. And if you can imagine what would be going on right now with pensioner poverty if the triple lock was not around, that quite frankly is a problem. But this can't continue. The triple lock is seen as unsustainable because of the volatility within the triple lock. But if we think about what it's trying to solve, and that is the volatility of prices that some people may face who have not been able to save properly. And I get back to not being able to save properly, or substantial changes that you cannot save for. And that is what people over a certain age are facing. Who would think fuel prices and energy prices would rise in the way that it has over the last 3, 4 years? No one would ever in their mind think food prices would get to the point where Marks and Spencer has to say that calls for food price caps is preposterous. I would never have thought this would be a sentence out of M&S a few years ago. And if I think if I'm the government, I would not like to be in the government right now, right? I don't want to be in there trying to make these decisions because I wouldn't say there's not much they can do. Their hands are tied because of the level of borrowing the UK has had and the price of borrowing. They can't politically borrow more money to help people at the moment. So if you're trying to make little changes to do what you can, I think you need to go on a PR campaign to try to show that there might be some little changes that they can do, because you're really writing out some of the big global things that have happened. I know, I've got the Guardian up. I know that they're looking at delaying some sanctions on oil and gas from Russia because of the Middle East conflict. I don't know if that's going to drop prices, and neither do they, but they're trying anything at the moment to try to drop these prices. And that's not comfort for people who are writing it out. But unfortunately, that is what it is. I don't know what
Yeah.
else to say, because quite frankly, at the moment, it is what it is. And they could, this is maybe when your local support system can really help and pull things up. I'm really interested in what Trust would say at the moment. I think they probably had more and more people at food banks at the moment. There are little things that they can do. Of course, there's things they can do for people on benefits, maybe increase the level that they have temporarily, that pre-pension or poverty people trying to get to state pension age and trying to get to their state pension. That little bit that they could do, which is actually not that much money and does help. But other than that, other than wage increasing, them improving the overall economic conditions, which they do have power over, there's really not much they can do on inflation.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I mean, I think my sort of complementary reflection would be, we're sort of tempting in the initial sort of phase of the first cost of living crisis to think about it as a sort of temporary phenomenon that required some sort of little moments here and there. But as you say, this has been years now, and actually the sort of impact of it will sustain. So, you almost, I think, need to think about the response to this in more structural and sort of systemic sort of ways. I'm going to start bringing us to a conclusion because we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to just offer a sort of final reflection, really, on what the one thing the government should do to support the UK labour market in the remainder of 2026 is. You've got about 30 seconds each. I know that's unfair, but just a sort of quick takeaway for colleagues on the call. And Emma, I'll come to you first.
Great, thank you. I'll keep it really brief. I'm very concerned by the state of youth unemployment right now. So I think anything that can be done to help, in particular, school leavers get into work, whether that's in their local area, local economy, and bringing in more businesses. I think Andrea has already flagged, and we know that so many youth organizations across the country are already doing good work, but it's bringing that to scale, but keeping it to local opportunities and getting more people into school age into businesses as they leave education.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. And Andrea, I'll give you the last word.
I'm going to be greedy and say two things very quickly. I think one, structural unemployment in the UK is very high. We have almost 1 million people over the age of 50 who either are looking for work or would like to work. And that is structural levels of people, not frictional, who are between jobs and have the skills needed to go into work. That is a structural problem with an economy that is not training people to do work and is not growing at a level that can absorb people who may not have the skills and need training. So that is one big thing for me, is solving that structural bit and also growing the economy. And this is really easy for me to say, but we need, I think, really targeted, well thought through plans to grow on a national level and not just in certain areas of the country.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. So I think that just about brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this afternoon. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for their contribution, to all of you for attending, and also the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together behind the scenes. You can keep up to date on the Work Foundation's research and engagement via our website and social media channels. We've got a very busy 6 weeks approaching. We've got new analysis on tackling the NEET challenge, reforms to zero-hour contracts, and a major summit on the relationship between health and work. Among our outputs, you can find out more details about all of those via our newsletter and our website. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.